The story of the assassins begins not with violence or daggers in the night, but with silence, with the mountains, with the wind moving over sharp stone ridges, and snow falling on fortresses that clung to cliffs like nests of birds. To understand this mysterious order, we must first understand the world they were born into, a world of uncertainty, faith, and endless conflict. It was the 11th century. The Middle East was a place of shifting empires, of rulers who rose and fell as quickly as storms over the desert. The great Seljuk Empire stretched across Persia, commanding armies and cities. The Crusades were beginning to send waves of warriors from Europe into the Holy Land, each one convinced of their divine mission. And in the middle of all this turmoil were countless communities, sects, and beliefs, each struggling to survive. Among them was a group that felt like strangers in their own land, the Nazari Ismailis. They were a branch of Islam that often found themselves hunted, misunderstood, or pushed aside by more powerful rivals. They lived in fear of armies greater than theirs, yet they also carried with them an idea flame of belief that would not go out. Into this fragile, dangerous world stepped a man who would shape history. His name was Hasanai Saba. He was a scholar, a thinker, and in time, the founder of what the world would come to call the Assassins. He was not born into wealth or power, but he carried something more enduring, conviction. And it was conviction that allowed him to build a network so secretive, so disciplined, that it would terrify kings and emperors. But before that, before the assassinations and the whispered legends, there were the mountains the Nazari needed, a home, a place where armies could not easily reach them, where they could build, plan, and survive. And so, high in the Alborz mountains of Persia, they found a fortress called Alamat. Imagine it now, sharp cliffs rising into the sky, a single, narrow path leading upward, a fortress perched at the very top, like a crown of stone. To enemies, it seemed unreachable. To Hazen and his followers, it was a sanctuary, a kingdom above the clouds. From Alamat, the assassins would emerge into history, carrying not banners or armies, but small blades, sharp minds, and a reputation that spread like a shadow across empires. And yet, in these earliest days, the world still did not know them. They were only a small group, devoted and secretive, building their lives within the walls of a mountain stronghold. They prayed, they trained, they studied, they dreamed of a world where their beliefs could survive, where their community could stand strong despite the powers that wished them gone. Night would fall over the fortress, and the stars would shine sharp in the cold mountain air. The men and women of Alamat would sit by fires, speaking in whispers, their words carried on the wind. Somewhere among them, Hazen himself would be watching, planning, waiting. The world below might belong to kings and caliphs, but here, in the silence of the mountains, a new power was being born. This is where the mystery begins, not with murder, but with survival, not with daggers, but with ideas. The assassins were, first and always, a people of belief living in a hidden world of stone, waiting for the moment when history would be forced to notice them. And as you close your eyes tonight, imagine yourself in those mountains, the cold air against your face, the sound of the wind rushing through narrow passes, the fortress standing above like a dream against the stars. You are safe inside its walls, surrounded by people who live with secrets too great for the world. to see. This is the beginning of the story of the assassins, the world's most dangerous secret society. A story not of numbers, but of whispers, not of armies, but of shadows. And it all begins with a mountain called Alamat, and a man named Hazen. History remembers him through legend, through whispers, and through a title that sounds more like myth than truth, the Old Man of the Mountain. But Hazen was not old when his journey began. He was a young man in Persia, drawn to knowledge, hungry for meaning in a world full of uncertainty. In his youth, he studied mathematics, astronomy, philosophy, and religion. He was not content with simple answers. His mind moved restlessly, seeking deeper truths. It is said that Hassan was born in the city of Qom, and later moved to Ray, a place of learning and culture. But while others studied for power or prestige, Hazen was different. He was drawn to the teachings of the Ismaili branch of Islam, teachings that spoke of hidden truths, of wisdom carried in secret, of a world where faith and knowledge were bound together. This decision was dangerous. To follow their path was to live always at risk of persecution. Yet Hazen did not hesitate. He gave his life to this cause. In time, he became more than a follower. He became a leader, a strategist, a man who could see not just the present, but the future. He understood that the Ismailis could not survive as wandering exiles, always running from armies greater than theirs. They needed safety. They needed a fortress. They needed a plan. And so Hazen began to travel. He studied the lands, the mountains, the strongholds that dotted Persia like watchtowers. He searched for the perfect place where his people could live. Hidden yet strong, vulnerable yet untouchable, that place, as fate would have it, was Alam-ut. The story goes that Hazen tricked his way into Alamat. The fortress, perched high above the cliffs, was owned by a local ruler. Hazen, through patience and cunning, infiltrated the garrison. Slowly, step by step, he gained influence until finally Alamat was his, not through battle, not through bloodshed, but through strategy, intelligence, and patience. Once Alamat belonged to him, Hazen transformed it. The fortress became not just a home, but a symbol. It was a sanctuary for the Ismailis, a place of study and training, a heart from which the pulse of a secret order would beat for centuries. Hazen himself lived with astonishing discipline. He did not seek wealth. He did not allow himself comfort. He lived simply, even harshly, demanding the same from his followers. He was a leader, but he was also a servant of his cause. From Alamat, Hazen created the network that would become infamous. He trained his followers in loyalty, in secrecy, in patience. He taught them that a single man with a dagger could change the fate of kingdoms. That belief was stronger than armies, and that invisibility was more powerful than banners. And yet, he remained within its walls, watching, guiding, sending his followers into the world beyond. The mountains became his throne, the fortress his kingdom, and the legends of the Old Man of the Mountain began to grow. Kings and sultans feared him. Crusaders whispered his name with unease, for they knew that from the fortress of Alamat, Hazen-I Seba commanded not an army in the open, but shadows in the dark. But here is the truth, most often forgotten. Before the terror, before the myths, before the blood, Hazen was simply a man of conviction, a man who looked at a crumbling, chaotic world and decided that his people would not disappear. The walls are high, the fires burn softly, and Hazen himself walks the courtyard. Quiet, stern, his eyes filled with thought. Around him, young followers whisper in corners, training in silence, sharpening their minds as much as their blades. The old man of the mountain is building something invisible, yet unstoppable, and the world below, still unaware, is about to feel the first shadows of the assassins. The fortress of Alamat stood high in the mountains of Persia, remote and nearly unreachable. From a distance, it looked like an eagle's nest, clinging to the rock. For those who lived there, it was not only a home, it was a world apart, a hidden place where loyalty was shaped, discipline was forged, and secrets were carefully guarded. Inside its walls, the assassins lived lives unlike those of ordinary men. Each new initiate who entered Alamat left behind the chaos of the outside world, left behind family, wealth, comfort, and sometimes even their very names. In exchange, they received something far more enduring, a purpose, a place in history, and a bond to a society that was both feared and admired. Life in Alamat was quiet but strict. The fortress had no room for luxury. The walls were simple, the chambers narrow, the courtyards plain. Hasanai Saba, the master of Alamat, allowed no softness, no weakness. Food was simple bread, dates, water, a little fruit when it could be found. Even Hasan himself lived with no greater comfort than the humblest of his followers. He ruled not with indulgence, but with example. The young men who arrived were not trained to fight in armies. The assassins did not raise battalions or wage battles in the open. Instead, they were trained in silence, in patience, in the art of blending into the world unnoticed. They studied languages so they could pass through distant lands. They studied politics so they could understand the minds of kings and rulers. They learned to read the currents of power as one might read the flow of a river, and, of course, they learned discipline of the body. Some practiced climbing the sheer cliffs that surrounded the fortress, building strength in silence. Others trained their hands to be steady, their eyes to stay sharp, their movements to be swift but invisible. Dagger training was a part of their life, but even more important was the training of the mind. For the dagger was nothing without willpower. What Hazen instilled in his followers was a kind of devotion that astonished outsiders. These men, later called Fidibi, those who sacrificed themselves, were prepared to obey without hesitation, to walk into danger without fear, to lay down their lives if it meant protecting the order. How did Hazen create such devotion? Some say it was through stories of paradise, whispered promises of reward after death. Some say it was the power of belief itself, that these young men truly saw themselves as instruments of a divine mission. Whatever the truth, their loyalty became legendary. The assassins were not many in number. They could never outmatch the armies of great empires, but they did not need to. One loyal follower, placed in the right place at the right time, could accomplish what thousands of soldiers could not. And so the training was not about strength in numbers, but precision, patience, and purpose. Life inside Alamat also carried moments of quiet humanity. At night, after training was done, the fortress would fall into silence. The young initiates would gather in the courtyard, sitting beneath the stars that glowed cold and bright above the Persian mountains. They would speak softly, their voices carried away by the wind, wondering where their missions might one day take them. Some would go into distant land Syria, Anatolia, even the Crusader kingdoms disappearing into foreign cities, dressed as merchants, scholars, or travelers. Others would remain close, guarding the mountain strongholds, keeping watch on the valleys below. But all of them knew that their lives were no longer their own. They belonged to something larger, something hidden, something that lived only in the shadows, and Hasten, himself silent, watchful, was always present, though often unseen. It is said he trusted no one fully, not even his closest followers. He lived in his study, surrounded by books, maps, and letters, guiding the order with a mind sharper than any blade. His presence was felt everywhere in Alamat, like the cold mountain air, sometimes comforting, sometimes heavy, always unshakable. For those who entered Alamat, there was no going back. They were no longer ordinary men of the world below. They were assassins trained in loyalty, patience, and silence. And though the world outside still slept unaware, the quiet fortress in the mountains was slowly shaping one of the most mysterious and feared brotherhoods in history. As you listen now, imagine the cold stone walls, the echo of footsteps in narrow corridors, the flicker of torchlight on ancient stones. Feel the weight of secrecy, the discipline, the silence, and let it lull you into rest, the way the mountains themselves cradle Alamat in their eternal watch. The assassins were never just a military force. They were never just a band of mountain rebels or secret killers moving through the shadows. What gave them their power, what gave them their fearsome reputation across the medieval world, was not only their daggers, but the aura of mystery that surrounded them. To understand the assassins is to understand the stories, the myths, and the whispers that spread from their mountain strongholds to the great courts of kings, to the bustling markets of merchants, to the frightened whispers of soldiers around distant campfires. At the heart of these stories were their beliefs, complex, often misunderstood, and cloaked in secrecy. The assassins belonged to the Ismaili branch of Islam, a group often persecuted and hunted by more powerful empires. Their leader, Hasan-I Sabah, taught them discipline and devotion, but also a vision that they were protectors of truth, defenders of hidden wisdom, chosen for a higher purpose that ordinary men could neither see nor understand to the outside world. However, these beliefs were not so clear. Rumors grew wild, painted by fear and ignorance. The assassins became not men, but phantoms. It was said they followed their leader with unshakable obedience, that they would walk into death without hesitation, that they lived not for themselves, but for a promise of paradise beyond the grave. One of the most famous legends told of how Hasan controlled his followers. Crusaders returning from the Holy Land carried back strange tales to Eurotales of gardens hidden within the mountains of Persia, where young initiates were led in secret. In these gardens, it was said, they tasted pleasures beyond imagining. Rivers of wine, fruits of every kind, music that lulled them into ecstasy, and women more beautiful than any seen before. Then the story went. The young men were returned to the fortress, told that what they had seen was but a glimpse of paradise, and if they followed Hasan's commands, if they obeyed without question, they would return there forever when they gave their lives for the cause. Historians today debate whether these gardens truly existed, or whether they were woven by enemies, exaggerations of fearful soldiers, or stories embellished by medieval writers who loved mystery and spectacle. Yet, whether true or not, the legend spread like fire. Across Europe, Hazen became known as the Old Man of the Mountain, and his followers became known not simply as warriors, but as men enchanted, almost bewitched, by visions of paradise, the very name by which they came to be known in Europe. The assassins is itself born of legend. Some claimed it came from the Arabic word hashashin, meaning hashishizers, suggesting that Hassan drugged his followers before sending them on their missions. Others believe this was a slander invented by enemies, an attempt to portray them as mindless slaves, dulled by narcotics. Whatever the truth, the word survived, and in time became the very term we use today for anyone who strikes from the shadows. But there were other myths as well. Some said the assassins could appear anywhere at any time, slipping past guards and gates as if invisible. Some said they could not be bribed or swayed, that they laughed at gold and ignored the promise of comfort. Others swore that the assassins were not even human at all, but spirits, shadows, or demons in human form. What is remarkable is how these myths created real power. A king, hearing that the assassins had marked him for death, might lose sleep for weeks, even months, always glancing over his shoulder, always fearing the invisible blade. Armies, knowing the assassins moved silently through the land, might hesitate before marching against their strongholds. Fear itself became their weapon, sharper than steel, more effective than an army. Inside the fortress, the assassins nurtured this image carefully. They allowed the myths to grow, never rushing to correct them. For Hazen understood something deep about human nature, that what people believe can often be stronger than what is true. And so the assassins became not just a brotherhood, but a legend, a story whispered in every corner of the medieval world. The Crusaders in the Holy Land, already facing hardships in an unfamiliar land, began to speak of them with awe. Richard the Lionheart, it was said, once received messengers from the assassins, who offered him friendship, poor, perhaps veiled threats. In European imagination, the assassins became almost otherworldly, a society of mystical killers bound by a code beyond ordinary understanding. Yet, within Alamut, the reality was more sober. The young men trained, prayed, studied, and obeyed. They lived in simplicity, often hardship. They were not drunkards of hashish or dreamers lost in gardens of illusion. They were disciplined, devoted, and bound by a sense of mission. And though they did not correct the world's wild tales, they lived a truth far more practical than the legends suggested. Still, the power of myth cannot be underestimated. It was myth that made kings fear them, myth that gave them leverage against armies far larger than their own, myth that carried their name across mountains and seas. As you rest now, imagine the firelight of a medieval tavern where merchants whisper of strange men from Persia. Picture a Crusader knight, weary from battle, telling his companions of silent figures who vanish into the night. Hear the quiet fear in their voices, the way they lower their tones, as if even speaking of the assassins might invite danger. In that fear, in those whispers, the assassins found their true strengths. Their beliefs gave them unity, but the world's legends gave them power. And so, from the quiet fortress of Alamut, an invisible empire of fear stretched outward, an empire built not of stone or steel, but of shadows, secrets, and stories. By the time the assassins had secured their strongholds and shaped their legends, the ripples of their influence stretched far beyond the mountain valleys of Persia. They were few in number compared to the great armies of sultans and kings, but their presence was felt everywhere, like a whisper carried by the wind. It was not steel alone that gave them power. It was fear, a fear that spread like invisible smoke into courts, palaces, and battlefields across the medieval world. Fear is a curious weapon. An army can be seen, a castle can be measured, but fear seeps into the mind. It grows in silence. It unsettles even the strongest ruler, because fear is built not on what is, but on what might be. And the assassins understood this better than anyone. Imagine a king in his palace, surrounded by guards, walls, and wealth. He commands armies of thousands, controls lands stretching for miles. And yet, when he hears that the assassins have marked him suddenly, all that protection feels fragile. He wonders if his guard is loyal. He wonders if the servant who pours his wine might be more than he seems. He wonders if a dagger waits for him in the shadows of his own chamber. It was said that the assassins could reach anyone, no matter how powerful. They did not wage battles against armies. They did not march on open fields. Instead, they struck where no one expected. A vizier walking through the marketplace, a general resting in his tent, a prince celebrating a feast, always swift, always precise, and then gone. But perhaps most chilling of all were the times they did not kill. There are stories of rulers waking in the morning to find a dagger laid upon their pillow, the blade gleaming in the candlelight. Assassin was seen. No alarm was raised, and yet the message was clear. We can reach you whenever we wish. This silent warning was often more powerful than bloodshed. For what greater terror is there than knowing that your life is spared not by your own strength, but by the choice of another? One of the most famous tales comes from the time of the Crusades. The Crusader states in the Holy Land, surrounded by enemies, lived in constant tension. And among the many dangers they faced, the assassins became both a threat and strangely a potential ally. Some leaders feared them deeply, while others tried to negotiate with them, hoping to secure peace through gifts and promises. It was during this time that the assassin's reputation reached Europe. Crusaders returned home with stories of men who obeyed their master without hesitation, who could slip unseen into the very heart of an enemy's camp, who were willing to die if it meant carrying out their mission. For men used to the clash of swords and shields, the idea of such invisible power was unsettling. In Persia and Syria, sultans too lived with the shadow of the assassins. The Seljuk Turks, who ruled much of the region, found themselves continually threatened. Viziers, high officials of the empire, were often targeted. Some fell to the dagger, others lived their lives in paranoia, never knowing if the next step outside their door might be their last. And then there were the Mongols. When they swept across Asia like a storm, destroying cities and kingdoms with terrifying force. Even they paused at the thought of the assassins. Their leader, Hulagu Khan, knew that defeating them would require more than armies. It would require crushing their strongholds, dismantling their networks, and extinguishing the very fear they had sown for generations. But that moment would come later, in another part of this tale. For now, in the centuries of their power, the assassins thrived not by matching numbers with their enemies, but by weaving a web of uncertainty. They made rulers doubt their safety. They made armies hesitate. They made even the mightiest feel vulnerable. And what made their weapon of fear so effective was its invisibility. A sword you can see, a siege you can prepare for. But how do you fight an enemy you cannot find? How do you defend yourself against shadows? This is why their reputation grew so large. People told stories, some true, some imagined, because the human mind cannot bear the unknown. To explain the assassins, they created legends. To give shape to their fear, they wove myths. And with each retelling, the assassins became larger than life, more terrifying than truth, until they were no longer men but symbols. Inside Alamat and other fortresses, Hazen and his successors knew this well. They cultivated this fear. They understood that in the great game of survival, perception was as powerful as reality. And so they sent their IDBs carefully, sparingly, ensuring that each mission would echo louder than a battle, that each dagger would cast a shadow larger than an army. And so the web spread. From Persia to Syria, from the courts of sultans to the castles of Crusaders, the assassins became a silent force binding the world in unease. No man of power was beyond their reach. No place was truly safe. And in this fragile balance, the assassins held their ground against enemies far mightier than themselves. As you listen, imagine the torchlight flickering in a medieval hall. A king sits awake, restless, unable to sleep, for though the walls around him are high and his guards are many, he cannot silence the thought, what if tonight the assassins come for me? That thought alone was enough. It was the weapon Seba gave to his order, and it was more enduring than steel. The mountains of Persia were far away from the castles of Europe, yet by the time the Crusaders set foot in the Holy Land, the name of the assassins was already traveling across the winds. To the knights who sailed across the Mediterranean, the assassins were at first a rumor-whispered tales told by traders, warnings shared by cautious allies. But as years passed, the Crusaders did not only hear of them, they met them. The Holy Land in the 12th and 13th centuries was a place of endless shifting alliances. Kings and sultans made treaties one year and broke them the next. Enemies became allies, allies became enemies, and amidst all this chaos, the assassins carved their own quiet path. They did not take sides in the great battles between cross and crescent knot fully. Instead, they sought survival, and survival meant dealing with whoever held power. The Crusaders, hardened by war, found themselves both threatened and strangely fascinated by this hidden society. They were men who came from a culture where wars were fought with banners flying, armies clashing, and courage displayed in open combat. To them, the silent, unseen methods of the assassins seemed almost unnatural, even unholy, and yet they could not deny the effectiveness. One of the earliest encounters came when the assassins sought to deal with the Crusader states directly. They sent envoys, men who appeared openly in the courts of Crusader princes, offering peace or warning of vengeance. Imagine the scene: a European lord, armored and proud, seated in his hall, when an envoy, dressed in the plain robes of the East, arrives. His words are calm, his manner polite, but his message is unmistakable. The assassins are watching, and they offer friendship or death. Among the most famous stories of Crusader contact with the Peekapoo Assassins is the tale of Richard the Lionheart, the great king of England who led the Third Crusade. The chronicles tell us that Richard was approached by emissaries of the Assassins, who sought to assure him that they bore him no ill will. Others claim that Richard himself may have admired their courage, or at least respected their reach. Whether these meetings were formal negotiations or simply whispered encounters, they left a lasting impression. But it was not only Richard who dealt with them. In the Crusader states of Antioch and Jerusalem, the assassins were both feared and courted. Some rulers sought their friendship, hoping to be spared their daggers. Others plotted against them, only to find themselves stalked by shadows. In one striking story, it is said that a Crusader lord once insulted the assassins. Weeks later, he awoke to find a dagger pinned beside his pillow. The blade was untouched, but the meaning was clear. The assassins had been inside his chamber, close enough to kill. And yet, they had chosen mercy this time. Even the great Muslim rulers of the age were not beyond the assassin's reach. Saladin, the legendary sultan who united Egypt and Syria against the Crusaders, became a target. Twice, the assassins attempted to strike him down. Once, as he camped during a siege, assassins crept into his tent at night. The story tells that Saladin awoke to the sound of movement and only just escaped death. His guards killed the intruders, but the attempt left its mark. The mighty Saladin, whose armies could shake kingdoms, now lived with the knowledge that daggers might wait for him in the dark. The attempt on Saladin's life was more than a simple act of aggression. It was a reminder of the assassin's unique power. They did not need to fight his armies or conquer his cities. By simply showing that they could reach him, they unsettled his rule, weakened his confidence, and spread whispers among his men. And yet, even Saladin, with all his might, did not march to destroy the assassins immediately. Perhaps he saw that crushing them would be costly. Perhaps he saw that negotiation was wiser. In time, the assassins and Saladin reached an uneasy peace, for in the shifting sands of the Middle East, alliances were often more practical than vengeance. What stands out about these encounters is the delicate balance the assassins maintained. They did not seek to dominate the world with armies or empires. They knew they could not. Instead, they moved between the cracks of power, appearing when least expected, withdrawing when it was wise, and always leaving behind an impression far larger than their numbers. The Crusaders, who had come from lands where open battle was seen as honor, carried stories of the assassins back to Europe. In castles and villages, people began to speak of this brotherhood in faraway Persia who obeyed their leader as if enchanted, who could pass through walls unseen, who killed without fear. The stories grew with each retelling, until the assassins became less a real group of men and more a legend, a shadow that haunted the imagination of the medieval world. Within Alamet and other strongholds, Hasani Seba and his successors surely knew of these stories, and perhaps they even smiled at them. For in truth, the assassins were not countless. They were not demons or spirits. They were men, disciplined and devoted. But they understood that in a world of armies and empires, myth was the strongest weapon of all. As you drift now into rest, imagine a Crusader knight in his tent, far from home, lying awake under the desert stars. His sword lies beside him. His armor gleams in the firelight, but still he cannot sleep, for he knows that while he can fight an army, he cannot fight the silent footsteps of the assassins. That fear, the fear of the unseen, was the true victory of the old man of the mountain. History remembers the assassins as shadows with daggers, slipping into the chambers of kings and vanishing like smoke. But behind those chilling images were real menzons, brothers, fathers, who swore their lives to the old man of the mountain. To understand their story, one must look not only at their fearsome acts, but also at the unbreakable bond of loyalty that bound them. The foundation of the assassin brotherhood was not numbers, nor weapons, nor even their mountaintop fortresses. It was devotion. Every young recruit who entered the gates of Alamat left behind his old life. Whatever ties he once had to his family, his village, or his ambitions were replaced by one single allegiance to Hazanai Seba and the cause he claimed to serve. But what inspired such loyalty? How could ordinary men, drawn from the valleys and towns of Persia and Syria, willingly walk into missions from which they knew they would never return? The answer lay in the very structure of the assassin's world. At Alamat, the recruits were trained not merely in stealth and weapons, but in discipline, faith, and trust. They were taught that life itself was fleeting, that the reward for obedience was eternal, and that their sacrifice was part of a divine struggle. In the stories told by their masters, death in service was not an end but a door. Through that door lay paradise, freedom from suffering, and eternal honor. And so the Fidawither devoted ones sexed their role with a calmness that astonished their enemies. Unlike soldiers of empires, they did not fight for pay or plunder. Unlike mercenaries, they did not switch sides for gold. Their mission was simple: obey, and if obedience meant death, then embrace it. One story, repeated across both Muslim and Crusader chronicles, tells of Hazanai Saba testing the loyalty of his men. In the presence of visiting nobles, he is said to have commanded one of his followers to leap from the high walls of Alamat. Without hesitation, the man obeyed, plunging to his death. The visitors were horrified, but Hazan remained calm. "Such is the loyalty of my men," he is said to have declared. Whether the story is fact or legend, it carried the truth of what made the assassins so powerful, a belief so absolute that life itself was a tool to be used. But loyalty was not always blind submission. The Fide were not puppets. They were men who understood the risks, who accepted the price, and who found a strange kind of peace in their sacrifice. For many, their loyalty grew not only from fear or faith, but also from respect. Hazanai Seba himself lived a life of strict discipline. He accepted no luxury, allowed no corruption, and demanded of himself the same devotion he demanded of his men. To followers, this made him not only a master, but an example. Outside Alamat, the effect of such loyalty was extraordinary. Enemies, who knew they might be targeted by a Fide, lived in constant fear. For how could one guard against a man who did not fear death? How could a king, no matter how many soldiers he commanded, protect himself from a single devoted dagger that might strike in the night? Imagine the scene in a crowded marketplace. A sultan rides through, surrounded by his guards, his banners waving. Yet among the crowd is a single man, dressed as a merchant, calm and unnoticed. He knows his mission will cost him his life, but he does not waver. To the watching eyes, he is no one, just another face in the crowd. But in his heart burns the certainty of his purpose. With one strike, the power of armies and wealth means nothing. It is easy for us, centuries later, to see the assassins only as fanatics. Yet, if we step closer, we might see something more complicated. Many of these men were poor, with little to lose. Others were drawn by the promise of meaning, of belonging to something greater than themselves. In a world where rulers, changed by the season and common lives, were crushed by hunger and war, the assassins offered not only fear but identity. To be a fidea was to matter, to be remembered, and so their loyalty became legend. Chroniclers from the West marveled at their devotion, describing them as if enchanted. Two crusaders, who often saw their own men desert for lack of pay or rebel over hunger. The assassins seemed almost inhuman. But the truth was simpler. They were human beings who had found a cause worth dying for, and they gave themselves fully to it. In the mountains, under the shadow of Alamout, these men trained, prayed, and prepared, knowing that their lives might end at a whispered command. To live each day with such certainty of death was no small thing, and yet they did so not with despair, but with a quiet acceptance. Some even found joy in it, the joy of being unshaken, the joy of belonging, the joy of fulfilling a destiny. When you think of loyalty, think of these men. Not loyalty bought by coins or forced by chains, but a loyalty freely given, stronger than fear, stronger even than life itself. That was the true weapon of the assassins, sharper than any dagger, more enduring than any fortress. As you let your own thoughts drift toward rest, imagine standing on the walls of Alamout at dusk. The mountains are silent, the sky is painted with the last red light of day, and beside you stands a fidea, calm and steady. He does not speak, for he has no need. His life is already given, his path already chosen, and in his stillness there is both peace and power. That was the essence of the assassin's loyalty, the kind of devotion that shaped legends, terrified kings, and carved their place in the pages of history. The story of the assassins is not just one of daggers in the dark. It is also a story of politics and diplomacy, a story of how a small sect hidden in mountain fortresses could hold power over kings, sultans, and even crusader lords who commanded thousands. The assassins were few, but their influence spread wide, carried not by armies but by whispers, by rumors, and by the knowledge that no one, no matter how high or mighty, was beyond their reach. Imagine for a moment the medieval world of the 12th century. Vast empires stretched across the land. The Seljuk Turks ruled over Persia, Syria, and Anatolia. The Crusader states clung to their fragile holdings along the Mediterranean coast. The Fatimid Caliphate still flickered in Egypt, though weakened. And beyond, looming in the east, were the Mongols, waiting like a storm on the horizon. In this world, the assassins had no great army to march in ranks across the battlefield. Their fortresses, scattered across Persia and Syria, were small islands of stone against the tide of empires. Yet, somehow, they survived. The secret of their endurance lay in the web of fear and diplomacy they spun across the land. Fear was their sharpest weapon. Two rulers, generals, and bishops alike. The assassins were not simply a nuisance, they were a constant shadow. A dagger could strike at any feast, any court, any camp. The effect was paralyzing. Leaders who would have otherwise marched their armies against Alamout often hesitated, calculating the risk. After all, What was the point of conquering a fortress if you might not live long enough to celebrate the victory? One tale tells of the great Saladin, the Kurdish sultan who fought the Crusaders and reclaimed Jerusalem. Saladin himself became a target of the assassins. Twice, Fide infiltrated his camp, slipping past guards to strike at him. He survived, but the message was clear. Even Saladin, with his armies and his fame, was not beyond their reach. According to some chroniclers, after these attempts, Saladin chose diplomacy over destruction. He negotiated with the assassins, reaching an understanding rather than risking endless attacks. This was the genius of the assassins' strategy. They did not always need to kill. Sometimes the threat of assassination was more powerful than the act itself. A whispered rumor that a ruler had been marked by the assassins could make him cautious, compliant, even willing to pay tribute or grant favors to avoid becoming the next victim. The assassins also used diplomacy with skill. They were not reckless fanatics, lashing out blindly. They were calculated, choosing enemies and allies with care. At times, they negotiated with Muslim rulers, at other times with Crusader lords. To them, survival mattered more than allegiance to one side or another. They were willing to weave alliances wherever they could find them. One of the most striking examples of this diplomacy is found in the chronicles of the Crusaders. The Knights Templar, fierce warriors of Christendom, are said to have entered into agreements with the assassins. In exchange for peace or, perhaps, payments, the assassins refrained from targeting certain lords. It was a strange sight, warriors of the cross and the mysterious sect of the East, not fighting but cooperating in their own quiet way. This ability to balance fear with negotiation allowed the assassins to survive for centuries. They were like spiders in their mountain webs, striking when needed, but also knowing when to sit still and let the web itself do the work. Their enemies often destroyed each other through wars and rivalries, while the assassins remained secure in their strongholds, watching, waiting, and choosing their moments carefully. The psychological power they wielded was immense. For a medieval ruler, the fear of the assassins was more than fear of death, was fear of the unknown. Who among his servants might be a Fide in disguise? Could the man pouring his wine, the guard at his door, the messenger delivering his letters, could any of them be an assassin waiting to strike? The uncertainty itself was torture. In this way, the assassins could control kings without lifting a sword, shaping decisions simply by existing. But diplomacy was not only about survival. It was also about influence. The assassins had their own political goals, tied to their religious beliefs and their struggle against rival powers. Through careful assassinations, they removed figures who threatened their cause. Through negotiations, they ensured breathing space to strengthen their fortresses and train new initiates. Every move was part of a larger game of survival in a hostile world. For the men who carried out these missions, loyalty was not only to Hasan-I Sabah or his successors, but to the brotherhood as a whole. Each Fide who gave his life became part of the fabric of the order, remembered and honored by those who remained. This memory gave the assassins a strength that empires could not easily crush. To the Crusaders, the assassins became figures of both fear and fascination, tales of their hidden gardens, their fearless devotion, and their secret rites traveled across Europe. Some stories were exaggerated, others pure invention, but they all fed the legend. By the time the name assassin reached the West, it had already become larger than life, a symbol of invisible power, and perhaps this was the greatest victory of the assassins' diplomacy. They became more than a sect. They became an idea so powerful that it haunted the minds of rulers across continents, shaping decisions, changing policies, and influencing history itself. As you let your own mind drift toward sleep, imagine this web stretched across mountains and deserts, across castles and cities. A web woven not from silk, but from whispers, loyalties, and fears. In the center sits the old man of the mountain, calm and watchful, tugging gently at the threads, knowing that even the faintest vibration will ripple across the whole. That was the power of the assassins, not sheer numbers, not armies, but the delicate, patient art of fear and diplomacy. And in that art, they became masters of survival. Their influence echoing through history long after their fortresses had fallen silent. For more than a century and a half, the assassins had survived against impossible odds. They had outlasted Seljuk sultans, defied Crusader kings, and even made peace with the mighty Saladin. From their mountain strongholds, they watched empires rise and fall, their own survival secured not by armies but by fear and cunning. But every story, no matter how strong its walls, must face its end. The end of the assassins came not through betrayal or weakness, but through the arrival of a force so vast and unstoppable that no fortress, no web of fear could stand against it. The Mongols. The Mongols were unlike any enemy the assassins had faced before. They swept across Asia like a storm, their cavalry striking with speed and ferocity, their campaigns leaving devastation in their wake. Kingdoms that had stood for centuries crumbled in a matter of months. Cities that had once thrived with markets and scholars were reduced to ashes and silence. The Mongols did not merely conquer, they annihilated. In the 13th century, this storm reached the world of the assassins. At first, there may have been hope. After all, the assassins had survived by negotiation before, by weaving their influence into the decisions of powerful rulers. Perhaps the Mongols, too, could be swayed, or at least delayed. But the Mongols were not like other powers. They were not afraid of daggers in the dark. They were not kings who could be intimidated by whispers of assassination. They were conquerors who valued fear of a different kind, the fear created by utter destruction. The Mongol commander, Hulagu, brother of the great Khan, was tasked with extending Mongol rule into Persia and beyond. His mission was clear: break every stronghold, silence every enemy. And among the first on his list were the assassins. The Mongols understood what the assassins represented, not just a small sect in the mountains, but a threat that could spread terror even into the courts of the Khan. Hulagu would tolerate no such shadow in his dominion. The assassins, under their then leader Rukht al-Din Korsha, faced an impossible choice. Their fortresses, perched on cliffs and surrounded by mountains, had resisted many enemies before. But the Mongols were different. They brought siege engines, capable of tearing through walls, armies vast enough to surround entire valleys, and a ruthless determination that gave no quarter. Alamot itself, the legendary fortress of Hazenai, Suba, was besieged in 1256. For years it had seemed impregnable, a place of myths, where legends of secret gardens and libraries filled with knowledge grew. But against the Mongols, its strength meant little. Hulag's forces surrounded it, cutting off supplies, tightening the noose with patient precision. Rukin al-Din Korsha, perhaps recognizing the hopelessness of resistance, chose surrender. It was a decision that may have saved some lives in the short term, but in the long sweep of history, it marked the end of an era. The Mongols entered Alamat, dismantling its defenses, burning its treasures, and erasing much of what the assassins had preserved. The great library of Alamet, said to contain volumes of science, philosophy, and history, was destroyed, whether by fire or scattering. The details are uncertain, but the loss was immense. Other assassin fortresses followed, one by one falling to Mongol power. Some resisted, their defenders fighting to the last, their devotion as strong as ever. But devotion could not stop siege engines, nor arrows that darkened the skies, nor armies that seemed endless. The assassins' web of fear unraveled. Where once their reputation had deterred rulers, now it meant little. The Mongols were not afraid of assassination. They expected it, and they responded with overwhelming force. If one commander was killed, another replaced him. If one camp was infiltrated, 10 more were ready to fight. Against this kind of enemy, the assassin's greatest weapon was useless. In the years that followed, the assassins ceased to exist as they once had. Their fortresses were abandoned or destroyed, their leaders scattered or killed. Some survivors fled to remote regions, their power broken, but their memory preserved in whispers. And yet, even in their fall, the assassins left a trace. The legends of their loyalty, their hidden gardens, their fearless devotion did not vanish with the flames of Alamat. Instead, they spread further, carried by travelers, merchants, and conquerors. In Europe, stories of the assassins grew ever wilder, their name transformed into a symbol of secret killers, of men who struck without warning. The truth of their history blurred with myth, until the assassins became less a sect and more a legend. The fall of the assassins reminds us of a truth older than any fortress. No matter how strong, no power lasts forever. Even the most secretive society, bound by loyalty stronger than life itself, could not escape the tide of history. The Mongols were too vast, too relentless, their shadow too wide. And so, the assassins, who once terrified kings and sultans, were reduced to silence. But as you drift into sleep, imagine the last night at Alamat, the mountains cold, the fortress quiet, the stars above watching. Ophidier stands at his post, knowing that the end is near. Yet in his heart there is no fear, for he has given his life already, long ago, when he first swore his loyalty. The stones may fall, the libraries may burn, the order may scatter, but his devotion remains unshaken. In that moment, as the world around him collapses, there is still peace. The assassins fell to the Mongols, but their story, half history, half legend, lives on. A story of shadows and mountains, of fear and faith, of loyalty and loss. When Alamat's stones fell and the Mongols scattered the last of the Fide, many believed the assassins were gone forever. Their fortresses reduced to ruins, their libraries burned, their leaders slain. Surely this was the end. But endings in history are rarely so simple. The assassins disappeared from sight, yes, but in another way. They became more powerful than ever. Their true legacy was not the fortresses they built or the rulers they terrified. Their true legacy was the story, the whisper of the dagger in the night, the image of men so loyal that they walked calmly into death. Stories are harder to destroy than walls, harder to burn than books. Stories slip past fire and rubble, carried on the tongues of travelers and the imaginations of listeners. And so, after the Mongols, the assassins lived on not as a sect, but as a myth. Across Europe, the Crusaders had already brought tales of these mysterious killers back to their homelands. In France, in England, in the courts of kings, people spoke of the assassins with a mix of fear and fascination. Their name became a symbol, twisted by rumor and mistranslation, until the very word assassin entered the languages of the world, no longer tied only to Alamat, but to anyone who killed in secrecy. To this day, that word is with Usa, shadow, cast by a long-vanished order. But myths grew larger still. Chroniclers in the West, who knew little of the assassin's true beliefs, embroidered their stories with fantasy. They told of hidden gardens, filled with rivers of wine and maidens, of paradise, where young initiates were led under the influence of strange herbs. There, the old man of the mountain promised them a glimpse of heaven, a reward they would earn in full only if they gave their lives in obedience. Whether such gardens ever existed is doubtful. Yet the legend endured, more powerful than truth. It fascinated poets and travelers, scholars and soldiers. To many, the assassins were no longer simply a sect of the Nezari Ismailist. They were a symbol of absolute devotion, of secret knowledge, of a mysterious East where reality blurred with dream, even after their fortresses were lost. The Nezari Ismailis survived in other lands, quietly, far from the grandeur of Alamat. They became communities of faith, no longer feared as killers, but respected as survivors. Their story, however, could not escape the shadow of their legendary past. In every whispered rumor, in every frightened tale, the assassins still lived today. When we hear the word assassin, we may think of daggers in the night, of secret brotherhoods, of shadows that slip past guards and strike without warning. Few remember the true story of Alamat, of Hazanai Seba, of the Phidiae who stood on the walls ready to leap at a single word. But perhaps it is fitting that their legacy is a mixture of history and legend. For it was never only their actions that mattered, it was the fear they inspired, the awe they commanded, the mystery they left behind. And maybe that is why, even now, the assassins have a place in our imagination. In novels, in games, in films, their memory is reshaped again and again. Sometimes romanticized, sometimes vilified, always mysterious. They have become part of the dream world we carry into the night, where history becomes story, and story becomes sleep. As you lie here, listening, let your thoughts drift like the fog around Alamat's peaks. Imagine the ruined stones of the fortress, quiet now, the voices of its people long faded. The mountains are still there, standing against the sky, silent witnesses to the rise and fall of empires. If you close your eyes, you might hear the echo of footsteps on the walls, the murmur of vows spoken centuries ago, the whisper of a dagger being drawn. But it is only a memory, a dream, a shadow in the night. The assassins are gone, but their story is eternal. A story of loyalty, stronger than life, of fear, more powerful than armies, of a brotherhood that lived and died in the mountains of Persia and Syria. Their fall was certain, their survival impossible, but their legend endures, reaching even into your quiet room tonight as you drift into sleep. So rest now, let the weight of history slip away like sand between your fingers. Let the mystery of the assassins become part of your dreams, a gentle shadow that lingers at the edge of memory. For the world is full of stories, and some stories like that of the assassins never truly end. Good night, traveler of time. Sleep well in the silence of history.